Chapter 2, Part 3 of the Influence of Sea Power upon History, 1660 to 1783, by Alfred Thayer Mahan. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. There was one well-known feature of all the military navies of that day which calls for a passing comment, for its correct bearing and value is not always, perhaps not generally seen. The command of fleets and of single vessels was often given to soldiers, to military men unaccustomed to the sea and ignorant how to handle the ship, that duty being entrusted to another class of officer. Looking closely into the facts, it is seen that this made a clean division between the direction of the fighting and of the motive power of the ship. This is the essence of the matter, and the principle is the same whatever the motive power may be. The inconvenience and inefficiency of such a system was obvious then as it is now, and the logic of facts gradually threw the two functions into the hands of one corps of officers, the result being the modern naval officer, as that term is generally understood. Unfortunately, in this process of blending, the less important function was allowed to get the upper hand. The naval officer came to feel more proud of his dexterity in managing the motive power of his ship than of his skill in developing her military efficiency. The bad effects of this lack of interest in military science became most evident when the point of handling fleets was reached, because for that military skill told most, and previous study was most necessary, but it was felt in the single ship as well. Hence it came to pass, and especially in the English navy, that the pride of the seaman took the place of the pride of the military man. The English naval officer thought more of that which likened him to the merchant captain than of that which made him akin to the soldier. In the French navy this result was less general, owing probably to the more military spirit of the government, and especially of the nobility, to whom the rank of officer was reserved. It was not possible that men whose whole association was military, all of whose friends looked upon arms as the one career for a gentleman, could think more of the sails and rigging than of the guns or the fleet. The English corps of officers was of different origin. There was more than the writer thought in Macaulay's well-known saying, "There were seamen and there were gentlemen in the navy of Charles II. But the seamen were not gentlemen, and the gentlemen were not seamen." The trouble was not in the absence or presence of gentlemen as such, but in the fact that under the conditions of that day the gentleman was preeminently the military element of society, and that the seaman, after the Dutch wars, gradually edged the gentleman, and with him the military tone and spirit, as distinguished from simple courage, out of the service. Even such men of family as Herbert and Russell, William III's admirals, says the biographer of Lord Hawke, were sailors indeed, but only able to hold their own by adopting the boisterous manners of the hardy tarpaulin. The same national traits which made the French inferior as seamen made them superior as military men, not in courage but in skill. To this day the same tendency obtains. The direction of the motive power has no such consideration as the military functions in the navies of the Latin nations. The studious and systematic side of the French character also inclined the French officer, when not a trifler, to consider and develop tactical questions in a logical manner, to prepare himself to handle fleets, not merely as a seaman, but as a military man. The result showed in the American Revolutionary War that, despite a mournful history of governmental neglect, men who were first of all military men, inferior though they were in opportunities as seamen to their enemies, could meet them on more than equal terms as to tactical skill, and were practically their superiors in handling fleets. The false theory has already been pointed out, which directed the action of the French fleet not to crushing its enemy, but to some ulterior aim; but this does not affect the fact that in tactical skill the military men were superior to the mere seamen, though their tactical skill was applied to mistaken strategic ends. The source whence the Dutch mainly drew their officers does not certainly appear, for while the English naval historian in 1666 says that most of the captains of their fleet were sons of rich burgomasters, placed there for political reasons by the Grand Pensionary, and without experience, Duquesne, the ablest French admiral of the day, comments in 1676 on the precision and skill of the Dutch captains in terms very disparaging to his own. It is likely, from many indications, that they were generally merchant seamen with little original military feeling, but the severity with which the delinquents were punished both by the state and by popular frenzy seems to have driven these officers, who were far from lacking the highest personal courage, into a sense of what military loyalty and subordination required. They made a very different record in 1672 from that of 1666. Before finally leaving the 4 days' fight, the conclusions of another writer may well be quoted. Such was that bloody battle of the 4 days, or Straits of Calais, the most memorable sea fight of modern days, not indeed by its results, but by the aspect of its different phases, by the fury of the combatants, by the boldness and skill of the leaders, and by the new character which it gave to sea warfare. More than any other, this fight marks clearly the passage from former methods to the tactics of the end of the 17th century. For the first time we can follow, as though traced upon a plan, the principal movements of the contending fleets. It seems quite clear that to the Dutch, as well as to the British, have been given a tactical book and a code of signals, or at the least written instructions, extensive and precise, to serve instead of such a code. We feel that each admiral now has his squadron in hand, and that even the commander in chief disposes at his will during the fight of the various subdivisions of his fleet. Compare this action with those of 1652, and one plain fact stares you in the face, that between the two dates naval tactics have undergone a revolution. Such were the changes that distinguished the war of 1665 from that of 1652. As in the latter epoch, the admiral still thinks the weather gauge an advantage for his fleet; but it is no longer, from the tactical point of view, the principal, we might almost say the sole, preoccupation. Now he wishes above all to keep his fleet in good order and compact as long as possible, so as to keep the power of combining during the action the movements of the different squadrons. Look at Ruyter at the end of the 4 days' fight. With great difficulty he has kept to windward of the English fleet, yet he does not hesitate to sacrifice this advantage in order to unite the two parts of his fleet which are separated by the enemy. If at the later fight off the North Foreland great intervals exist between the Dutch squadrons, if the rear afterward continues to withdraw from the centre, Ruyter deplores such a fault as the chief cause of his defeat. He so deplores it in his official report. He even accuses Tromp, who was his personal enemy, of treason or cowardice, an unjust accusation, but which none the less shows the enormous importance thenceforth attached during the action to the reunion of the fleet into a whole strictly and regularly maintained. This commentary is justified in so far as it points out general aims and tendencies, but the results were not as complete as might be inferred from it. The English, notwithstanding their heavy loss in the 4 days' battle, were at sea again within 2 months, much to the surprise of the Dutch; and on the 4th of August another severe fight was fought off the North Foreland, ending in the complete defeat of the latter, who retired to their own coasts. The English followed and effected an entrance into one of the Dutch harbors, where they destroyed a large fleet of merchantmen as well as a town of some importance. Toward the end of 1666, both sides were tired of the war, which was doing great harm to trade and weakening both navies to the advantage of the growing sea power of France. Negotiations looking toward peace were opened, but Charles II, ill disposed to the United Provinces, confident that the growing pretensions of Louis XIV to the Spanish Netherlands would break up the existing alliance between Holland and France, and relying also upon the severe reverses suffered at sea by the Dutch, was exacting and haughty in his demands. To justify and maintain this line of conduct, he should have kept up his fleet, the prestige of which had been so advanced by its victories. Instead of that, poverty, the result of extravagance and of his home policy, led him to permit it to decline. Ships in large numbers were laid up, and he readily adopted an opinion which chimed in with his penury, and which, as it has had advocates at all periods of sea history, should be noted and condemned here. This opinion, warmly opposed by Monk, was, that as the Dutch were chiefly supported by trade, as the supply of their navy depended upon trade, and as experience showed nothing provoked the people so much as injuring their trade, his majesty should therefore apply himself to this, which would effectually humble them, at the same time that it would less exhaust the English than fitting out such mighty fleets as had hitherto kept the sea every summer. Upon these motives the king took a fatal resolution of laying up his great ships and keeping only a few frigates on the cruise. In consequence of this economical theory of carrying on a war, the Grand Pensionary of Holland, De Witt, who had the year before caused soundings of the Thames to be made, sent into the river under De Ruyter a force of 60 or 70 ships of the line, which on the 14th of June, 1667, went up as high as Gravesend, destroying ships at Chatham and in the Medway, and taking possession of Sheerness. The light of the fires could be seen from London, and the Dutch fleet remained in possession of the mouth of the river until the end of the month. Under this blow, following as it did upon the Great Plague and the Great Fire of London, Charles consented to peace, which was signed July 31, 1667, and is known as the Peace of Breda. The most lasting result of the war was the transfer of New York and New Jersey to England, thus joining her northern and southern colonies in North America. Before going on again with the general course of the history of the times, it will be well to consider for a moment the theory which worked so disastrously for England in 1667, that, namely, of maintaining a sea war mainly by preying upon the enemy's commerce. This plan, which involves only the maintenance of a few swift cruisers, and can be backed by the spirit of greed in a nation, fitting out privateers without direct expense to the state, possesses the specious attractions which economy always presents. The great injury done to the wealth and prosperity of the enemy is also undeniable, and although to some extent his merchant ships can shelter themselves ignobly under a foreign flag while the war lasts, this guerre de course, as the French call it, this commerce destroying, to use our own phrase, must, if in itself successful, greatly embarrass the foreign government and distress its people. Such a war, however, cannot stand alone; it must be supported, to use the military phrase. Unsubstantial and evanescent in itself, it cannot reach far from its base. That base must be either home ports, or else some solid outpost of the national power on the shore or the sea, a distant dependency, or a powerful fleet. Failing such support, the cruiser can only dash out hurriedly a short distance from home, and its blows, though painful, cannot be fatal. It was not the policy of 1667, but Cromwell's powerful fleets of ships of the line in 1652 that shut the Dutch merchantmen in their ports and caused the grass to grow in the streets of Amsterdam. When instructed by the suffering of that time, the Dutch kept large fleets afloat through two exhausting wars. Though their commerce suffered greatly, they bore up the burden of the strife against England and France united. 40 years later, Louis XIV. Was driven by exhaustion to the policy adopted by Charles II through parsimony. Then were the days of the great French privateers, Jean Bart, Forbin, Duguay Trouin, Ducasse, and others. The regular fleets of the French navy were practically withdrawn from the ocean during the Great War of the Spanish Succession, 1702 to 1712. The French naval historian says, unable to renew the naval armaments, Louis XIV. Increased the number of cruisers upon the more frequented seas, especially the Channel and the German Ocean, not far from home, it will be noticed. In these different spots the cruisers were always in a position to intercept or hinder the movements of transports laden with troops, and of the numerous convoys carrying supplies of all kinds. In these seas, in the center of the commercial and political world, there is always work for cruisers. Notwithstanding the difficulties they met, owing to the absence of large friendly fleets, they served advantageously the cause of the two peoples, French and Spanish. These cruisers, in the face of the Anglo-Dutch power, needed good luck, boldness, and skill. These three conditions were not lacking to our seamen, but then what chiefs and what captains they had! The English historian, on the other hand, while admitting how severely the people and commerce of England suffered from the cruisers, bitterly reflecting at times upon the administration, yet refers over and over again to the increasing prosperity of the whole country, and especially of its commercial part. In the preceding war, on the contrary, from 1689 to 1697, when France sent great fleets to sea and disputed the supremacy of the ocean, how different the result! The same English writer says of that time: with respect to our trade, it is certain that we suffered infinitely more, not merely than the French, for that was to be expected from the greater number of our merchant ships, but than we ever did in any former war. This proceeded in great measure from the vigilance of the French, who carried on the war in a piratical way. It is out of all doubt that, taking all together, our traffic suffered excessively. Our merchants were many of them ruined. Macaulay says of this period: during many months of 1693 the English trade with the Mediterranean had been interrupted almost entirely. There was no chance that a merchantman from London or Amsterdam would, if unprotected, reach the Pillars of Hercules without being boarded by a French privateer. And the protection of armed vessels was not easily obtained. Why? Because the vessels of England's navy were occupied watching the French navy, and this diversion of them from the cruisers and privateers constituted the support which a commerce-destroying war must have. A French historian, speaking of the same period in England, 1696, says, "The state of the finances was deplorable. Money was scarce, maritime insurance 30 per cent. The Navigation Act was virtually suspended, and the English shipping reduced to the necessity of sailing under the Swedish and Danish flags." Half a century later the French government was again reduced, by a long neglect of the navy, to a cruising warfare. With what results? First, the French historian says, from June 1756 to June 1760, French privateers captured from the English more than 2,500 merchantmen. In 1761, though France had not, so to speak, a single ship of the line at sea, and though the English had taken 240 of our privateers, their comrades still took 812 vessels. But, he goes on to say, the prodigious growth of the English shipping explains the number of these prizes. In other words, the suffering involved to England in such numerous captures, which must have caused great individual injury and discontent, did not really prevent the growing prosperity of the State and of the community at large. The English naval historian, speaking of the same period, says, "While the commerce of France was nearly destroyed, the trading fleet of England covered the seas. Every year her commerce was increasing. The money which the war carried out was returned by the produce of her industry." 8,000 merchant vessels were employed by the English merchants. And again, summing up the results of the war, after stating the immense amount of specie brought into the kingdom by foreign conquests, he says, "The trade of England increased gradually every year, and such a scene of national prosperity, while waging a long, bloody, and costly war, was never before shown by any people in the world." On the other hand, the historian of the French navy, speaking of an earlier phase of the same wars, says, "The English fleets, having nothing to resist them, swept the seas. Our privateers and single cruisers, having no fleet to keep down the abundance of their enemies, ran short careers. 20,000 French seamen lay in English prisons." When, on the other hand, in the War of the American Revolution, France resumed the policy of Colbert and of the early reign of Louis XIV, and kept large battle fleets afloat, the same result again followed as in the days of Tourville. "For the first time," says the Annual Register, forgetting or ignorant of the experience of 1693, and remembering only the glories of the later wars, "English merchant ships were driven to take refuge under foreign flags." Finally, in quitting this part of the subject, it may be remarked that in the island of Martinique the French had a powerful distant dependency upon which to base a cruising warfare, and during the 7 Years' War, as afterward during the First Empire, it, with Guadeloupe, was the refuge of numerous privateers. The records of the English admiralty raise the losses of the English in the West Indies during the first years of the 7 Years' War to 1,400 merchantmen taken or destroyed. The English fleet was therefore directed against the islands, both of which fell, involving a loss to the trade of France greater than all the depredations of her cruisers on the English commerce, besides breaking up the system. But in the War of 1778 the great fleets protected the islands, which were not even threatened at any time. So far we have been viewing the effect of a purely cruising warfare, not based upon powerful squadrons, only upon that particular part of the enemy's strength against which it is theoretically directed, upon its commerce and general wealth, upon the sinews of war. The evidence seems to show that even for its own special ends such a mode of war is inconclusive, worrying but not deadly. It might almost be said that it causes needless suffering. What, however, is the effect of this policy upon the general ends of the war, to which it is one of the means, and to which it is subsidiary? How, again, does it react upon the people that practice it? As the historical evidences will come up in detail from time to time, it need here only be summarized. The result to England in the days of Charles II has been seen. Her coast insulted, her shipping burned almost within sight of her capital. In the War of the Spanish Succession, when the control of Spain was the military object, while the French depended upon a cruising war against commerce, the navies of England and Holland, unopposed, guarded the coasts of the peninsula, blocked the port of Toulon, forced the French succors to cross the Pyrenees, and by keeping open the sea highway, neutralized the geographical nearness of France to the seat of war. Their fleet seized Gibraltar, Barcelona, and Minorca, and, cooperating with the Austrian army, failed by little of reducing Toulon. In the 7 Years' War the English fleets seized, or aided in seizing, all the most valuable colonies of France and Spain, and made frequent descents on the French coast. The War of the American Revolution affords no lesson, the fleets being nearly equal. The next most striking instance to Americans is the War of 1812. Everybody knows how our privateers swarmed over the seas, and that from the smallness of our navy the war was essentially, indeed solely, a cruising war. Except upon the lakes, it is doubtful if more than 2 of our ships at any time acted together. The injury done to English commerce, thus unexpectedly attacked by a distant foe which had been undervalued, may be fully conceded; but on the one hand the American cruisers were powerfully supported by the French fleet, which, being assembled in larger or smaller bodies in the many ports under the Emperor's control from Antwerp to Venice, tied the fleets of England to blockade duty; and on the other hand, when the fall of the Emperor released them, our coasts were insulted in every direction. The Chesapeake entered and controlled, its shores wasted, the Potomac ascended, and Washington burned. The northern frontier was kept in a state of alarm, though there squadrons, absolutely weak but relatively strong, sustained the general defence; while in the South the Mississippi was entered unopposed, and New Orleans barely saved. When negotiations for peace were opened, the bearing of the English toward the American envoys was not that of men who felt their country to be threatened with an unbearable evil. The late Civil War, with the cruises of the Alabama and Sumter and their consorts, revived the tradition of commerce destroying. In so far as this is one means to a general end, and is based upon a navy otherwise powerful, it is well; but we need not expect to see the feats of those ships repeated in the face of a great sea power. In the first place, those cruises were powerfully supported by the determination of the United States to blockade, not only the chief centres of Southern trade, but every inlet of the coast, thus leaving few ships available for pursuit. In the second place, had there been 10 of those cruisers where there was one, they would not have stopped the incursion in Southern waters of the Union fleet, which penetrated to every point accessible from the sea. And in the third place, the undeniable injury, direct and indirect, inflicted upon individuals and upon one branch of the nation's industry, and how high that shipping industry stands in the writer's estimation need not be repeated, did not in the least influence or retard the event of the war. Such injuries, unaccompanied by others, are more irritating than weakening. On the other hand, will any refuse to admit that the work of the great Union fleets powerfully modified and hastened an end which was probably inevitable in any case? As a sea power, the South then occupied the place of France in the wars we have been considering, while the situation of the North resembled that of England; and, as in France, the sufferers in the Confederacy were not a class, but the government and the nation at large. It is not the taking of individual ships or convoys, be they few or many, that strikes down the money power of a nation. It is the possession of that overbearing power on the sea which drives the enemy's flag from it, or allows it to appear only as a fugitive, and which, by controlling the great common, closes the highways by which commerce moves to and from the enemy's shores. This overbearing power can only be exercised by great navies, and by them on the broad sea, less efficiently now than in the days when the neutral flag had not its present immunity. It is not unlikely that in the event of a war between maritime nations, an attempt may be made by the one having a great sea power and wishing to break down its enemy's commerce to interpret the phrase effective blockade in the manner that best suits its interests at the time, to assert that the speed and disposal of its ships make the blockade effective at much greater distances and with fewer ships than formerly. The determination of such a question will depend not upon the weaker belligerent, but upon neutral powers. It will raise the issue between belligerent and neutral rights; and if the belligerent have a vastly overpowering navy, he may carry his point, just as England, when possessing the mastery of the seas, long refused to admit the doctrine of the neutral flag covering the goods. Chapter 2